And then we'll get started. Thank you, Lord. This has actually been going on for some time. And I thank you that there are people of a similar mind. And we all need that. We don't all have to be of the same mind. That's why we should have different small groups. Because people have different needs or different wants or different things they want to learn. Help us to be motivated to make that happen so that we will make a difference in our community. And by having a passionate conviction to share your word. In Jesus' name, amen. I'm going to, you can go ahead and bring Darlene Mary up. Last week, I'm going to revert back a little bit. This Darlene gal is Mary Stuart, or better known as Mary Queen of Scots. Brian mentioned something last week that I kind of skirted over. Because much of what was going on in France and England concurrently was going on in Scotland. Now, we back up a few years, and in Scotland, we need to bear in mind that Scotland, by comparison to the rest of Europe, was populated by savages at this stage. They were still considered savages, and for the most part, they may have been, comparatively, to then modern Europe and England and so forth. If you're familiar with the terrain of Scotland at all, it's a series of moors and high peaks and not conducive to many established settlements. Now there are some, Glasgow, Edinburgh, that sort of, but they're few and far between. Protestantism, specifically Presbyterianism, had been legally established in Scotland. Now Mary at that time was married to Francis II of France. So she had grown up and was living and was used to the society and patronizing and being waited on hand and foot as Queen of France. Now, obviously, Francis II, you may recall, was a staunch papist. Mary, thusly, became a staunch papist. Now, like I say, in and of themselves, I don't have a problem with that. It's just they bought into, we are getting rid of Protestantism by any means possible. So, Francis dies, Mary gets in a ship and goes home to rule Scotland, her native land. She is greeted by the Scots with open arms. She's welcomed, they're glad to have her, one of their own, ruling Scotland again, and everything is wonderful. But pretty soon after Mary gets there, go to the next one, and she was, by the way, considered a lovely, vivacious, open, well-educated young lady, and everyone adored her for that reason. And the Scottish nobles, even though they were Protestant, started sucking up to Mary because she was a sweetie, and they were all trying to get next to her, and her charms, not that she was profligate in any way, but her natural charm won many of them over. John Knox was the one who fought for Presbyterianism after Mary came. When Mary came, she made no secret of the fact Well, she did it first. But she very soon started to outlaw some of the very things that had been approved by the Scottish Parliament as far as religious freedom is concerned. Mary started to overturn that. In fact, in time, some of the leaders of the Reform or Presbyterian movement had trumped up charges placed against them, and off to the dungeons they went. And this was all Mary's doing. Now, John Knox eventually was called by Mary because John, from his pulpit, was telling his listeners, who sometimes numbered in the thousands, that this woman was robbing them of their natural rights. Mary ultimately called John Knox to the castle of Holyrood, where she resided. This was not a good thing under normal circumstances, to be called by a papist, a queen no less, into her castle to answer for all the remarks he had been making about her. And he went in and he just told her straight up, "Madam, what you're doing is wrong. We're not going to stand for this." And he pretty much let her know why the Protestant reform was necessary. And he meant it for her goodwill as well, hoping that she would come to see the light. I'm not going to dwell on this, but the long story short is that Mary was run out of Scotland. The Scots, known as very stubborn and hard-headed people, had sold out to their Reformed faith and were not going to have this. Now, I want to digress a little bit because Philip, we mentioned last week, Philip II of Spain had built the Spanish Armada. And we talked about all of that and how that happened and how it didn't work out. But Mary was a part of that plot. Now in modern day, in our day, Mary, Queen of Scots, has been very much romanticized in film and in books and all that. Mary was not a nice person as far as, I mean, she was in a worldly way, but she was not nice to her enemies. And when she did not succeed, because the idea was that if she could control Scotland for the Church of Rome, that would give the papist a way into England, because they were losing England under Elizabeth. In fact, with the Armada, they lost England. But they were worried about that, and they were looking for another avenue to attack England, because the Armada showed that they, at this point, were willing to invade and conquer England. So when Mary couldn't do what she needed to do in Scotland, she went to her sweet sister, or ended up there, in England, Elizabeth, her half-sister. Interestingly, by the way, Mary was in the line of succession because she was the daughter of Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine. So she was in the line of succession to the British crown as well. So off she goes to England. Now, if Mary had been smart, she'd have kept her mouth shut. The problem is, the plotting continued. And not only that, but there were some English nobles who I may be captivated by her charm, I don't know. But some English nobles that got involved in helping her plot for Philip, or whoever, to put her in Elizabeth's place, so England could that way be conquered for the Church of Rome. If they couldn't beat them militarily, they would usurp the throne. Elizabeth found out about this. And Elizabeth could be Elizabeth when she wanted to be. And she found out about this, but she also knew that Mary had her adherents. So she needed to wind her way through this labyrinth very carefully. And she did. And ultimately, Mary lost her head. And so did those who plotted with her. But that's what had happened in Scotland. John Knox, and after him a man named Thomas Melville, are the ones that actually saved Scotland for Protestantism. And it's never gone back. Okay. Now, we've discussed what happened to the Huguenots in France. We've talked about what happened in England and a little bit about Scotland. Another real tragedy had to be displayed to the world in order for Protestantism to survive. And this occurred in Europe. What is called the 30 Years' War. We can go to the next one. And this, by the way, was James VI, who was Mary's son. And he grew up after the fact, and this is all, I'm not going to get into this, but James VI carried the same traits as his mother. He got into the realm of Scotland, then was in the succession to England, got in the throat of England, and because of his ways and his trying to revert back to the papacy, like his mom, is the one who was the ruler that resulted in the English Civil War with Oliver Cromwell, and his get, Charles I, ended up being beheaded, and that's what went on that end, okay, the continue on, or the culmination of Mary Queen of Scots. So that's her son, James. He looks like a Scot, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm.
He really does.
He's sure not as pretty as she is.
No,
Must have taken after his dad.
yeah, I'm thinking that,
They did.
yeah,
Maybe they enhanced her photograph. I mean, her painting.
yeah, maybe they photoshopped her.
Yeah, something.
Let's go on to the next one now. The 30 Years' War was a terrible, terrible thing. It is said, although they did not take censuses back in this day, it is said that more Germans died in the 30 Years' War than in the period of January to March of World War II, 1945. And if you know anything about that time, that was the time where the most intensive bombings of Germany went on. It started out, interestingly, Bohemia was largely Protestant. And a gentleman named Ferdinand had become emperor and thereby assumed the title of King of Bohemia. Bohemia was Protestant and Ferdinand was Catholic. The Bohemians wanted nothing to do with Ferd. So Ferdinand sent two representatives to announce his coming to Bohemia. They went into the governor's palace to announce Ferdinand's coming arrival, and the Protestants immediately tossed them out of the window. Now, that doesn't sound like good Protestants. But they did. They pitched them right out of the castle windows. Unexpectedly, both of them survived. And the Bohemian Revolution, or revolt, started. So it pretty much all started down here. There are several interesting characters that go through this, but the main thing to remember is at the beginning of the 30 Years' War, the Protestant forces, and they came together, they created armies, and let me take a second and go down a rabbit trail here. Not only did the church lose when they decided to become political, and Rome changed when they decided to participate in worldly affairs, but Protestantism did too. Because Protestantism took up arms. And back in Luther's day, Luther was unwilling to counsel or sanction that. He said no. And remember, we talked early on, the greatest growth in the Church of Christ was when they were being martyred for their faith. And that is the hand of God. This is the hand of man. Now, granted, we understand fighting for freedom, we understand fighting to protect your loved ones and so forth. But even on the Protestant side, there were a good many participants who participated for political ends that had nothing to do with their faith. Their adherents were Protestant, and they wanted to maintain calm in their kingship or princedom or whatever the case may be. So that was important to them, but it was for political reasons. Now that's not to say all of them were that way, but a good many on both sides were driven by politics. We were not immune, the good guys were not immune from this. Okay? And what happened was the Catholic forces were drawn from Spain, who had very well drilled and disciplined soldiers because they had been going over to the Americas by this point for, well, since early 1500s, so more than 100 years. And these fellows were well drilled, well disciplined, and led by leaders that knew what they were doing. The Protestants, on the other hand, because Germany was made up of like 200 different states or independent cities, they couldn't agree on who was in control of what. So when they did come together, they were typically beaten, and beaten badly. In a battle of White Mountain in 1620, they were roundly defeated and sued for peace. If it had not been for Frederick V, and I think I got him, where's he? Scoot on 3 over, Al, please, and then we'll come back to the map. There he is. Frederick V of Saxony also had interests in other parts of Germany. So when Bohemia collapsed, he refused to give in for political reasons. He did not want to lose the lands that he had in those areas. So he continued the fight. Frederick V was the elector of what they called the Palatinate. That was a section of land pretty much in the north-central part of what is now Germany. Frederick continued the struggle, but once again, he was soundly beaten nearly every time he was faced. Now there was a fellow named Mansfield who was the head general of the Protestant armies. There was a fella, can we go back one now? Handsome fella. One more. This gentleman was the head of the Spanish or imperial armies, General Tilly. Mansfield was really a rather good general, but he lacked the disciplined troops that Tilly did, and Tilly at that point had nearly never-ending or unending resources, whereas the Germans had to pull from different sections. They had no head like Philip II of Spain. They had to beg supplies and troops and guns. Ultimately, they were defeated. Again. Then, because Christian IV of Denmark had interest in German lands, enter Christian IV to carry on the good fight for Protestantism. Now, in fairness to Christian, he was a devout Lutheran, to be sure. Doesn't change the fact that he did not want to lose his holdings in Germany. So, over the Danes come to continue the fight. The Danes were able to continue for 4 more years with varying degrees of success. But they too were defeated. And a truce was signed in the city of Lubeck, calling a halt to open hostilities. Then probably the greatest general of his age. Let's go over 3, please, Al. There he is. Gustavus Adolphus was the king of Sweden. And he had wanted to enter the conflict on the Protestant side for several years. But he had an ongoing war with Poland that he had to conclude before he could do that against Polish Catholics. Now, the way he got around this and brought that to a conclusion, and people don't generally know this, but he spoke to the Tsar all the way up in Russia. And of course, Russia was Eastern Orthodox, but they had their disagreements with the Catholics too, not to mention the fact that the Tsar wanted to control Polish Silesia. So Gustavus was able to negotiate with the Tsar to complete his war with Poland, so he was free to become embroiled or involved in the 30 Years' War on the Protestant side. Now, I have to tell you that Gustavus Adolphus is probably the only leader, either political or military, who had nothing to gain and wanted nothing but to save Protestantism. That's all he wanted. When he came ashore from Sweden on the North German coast, he swore that he would not keep 1 inch of ground. He wanted nothing but to secure Protestantism and the right of a free conscience. And he took with him a Swedish army, small, but probably the toughest fighters in Europe. They were used to the cold. They were used to deprivation. They had been fighting the Poles and the Finns for a long time. In fact, they fought Christian of Denmark at one point. But they were completely sold out to Gustavus. Period. Every morning in the Swedish camp, they had devotions. Every morning in the Swedish camp, they had a worship service. Every member of the army attended. There was nowhere that the Swedish army marched where they pillaged or stole or disturbed the citizens other than what a battle might do, and that can't be helped in a war. They were totally honorable in everything they did. And again, they were totally sold out to follow Gustavus Adolphus. And they conquered the imperial army everywhere they went. Everywhere they went. 5 years later, because Gustavus was the type of man he was, in a battle called Lutzen, he was killed because he was leading his troops. And he died just as he lived, honorably and totally mourned by his troops. Now the Swedes continued. Now here's an interesting twist. The French, who had just finished the total destruction of the Huguenots, the Protestants in France, decided to come into the war on the side of the Protestants.
What?
Now, guess why they did this? First of all, the negotiations were carried out by, you'll recognize the name because it's infamous, and especially in the Three Musketeers. Cardinal Richelieu negotiated to bring the French in on the side of the Protestants. Richelieu was probably the single most person responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Huguenots in France, in his direction of the Jesuits that were there fulfilling that task. But Louis, and I think we've got a picture of Louis here at the end. Two more, Al.
You got Richelieu too.
Yeah. Louis the 14th, the Sun King. I'll tell you something funny in a minute. But Louis, the one thing he hated more than Protestants was Philip of Spain. Because he was surrounded on all sides. And I won't do this, but if we went back to the map, France, as it stood at that time, coast and then looks something roughly like that, was surrounded on all sides by the Holy Roman Empire, or holdings that were controlled by Philip and or his uncle Ferdinand. All around. Remember, we saw on the map last week that only France and England were not available or under the thumb of the Holy Roman Empire. Only those two. So, when Gustavus Adolphus died, the fighting continued, but without the success because Gustavus was gone. And Henry started to get really nervous, or Louis started to get really nervous because he saw if the German states collapsed, there was nobody left for them to come after but him. So Louis, being the pragmatic politician that he was, let's join the Protestant side. Now, the Protestants were very nervous about these overtures from Henry because they knew what had gone on in France. They didn't trust him. And they trusted Richelieu. Next one now. They trusted the good Cardinal Richelieu even less. He's about as devious a looking man as I've ever seen. Anyway, ultimately though, the 30 Years' War came to an end with the Treaty of Westphalia, which guaranteed freedom of conscience in the formerly Protestant states, largely because of France. Because the infusion of French troops is ultimately what beat the Spanish and the imperial forces. That's one of the paradoxes. I mean, if you can't see God's hand in this, God used the killers of the Protestants in France to save Protestantism. And not from goodwill, but because of greed and avarice. Go back to Louis for a second, please. If you all ever... Louis XIV is revered as the Sun King in French lore. Louis, you know how the cardinals have the gowns on, and most kings you see with the gowns on? Louis almost always had his portrait painted with his stockings showing. Because Louis was inordinately proud of his legs. This is serious.
Are you saying he's vain?
But in the dictionary under narcissism, there's a picture of Louis. Okay. I should also point out that not only was he not fond of Protestants, but when, and maybe you've seen pictures, I should have gotten one, but when Louis had the incredible palace at Versailles built, have you ever seen pictures of it? It's phenomenal. I mean, even the walls, some of the walls are gilt with gold. It's incredible. But initially, where it was built was a swamp. Louis had laborers backfill the swamp, laborers build the palace, and tens of thousands of Frenchmen died to build that palace. But it was still considered one of the marvels of the modern world. And quite frankly, I would think with justification, because it is positive. If you're into that type of ornateness, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable. But the biggest thing that I think we take away, or should take away, from the 30 Years' War is back in that time. Can we go back to the map, Al, and we'll just stop there and stop our bouncing back and forth. It's very easy to look at a map and just see colors and borders and the names of localities and all that. What a map represents are people, the homes of people. You can't tell that from a two-dimensional representation of a landmass. But let me tell you what happened as a result of the war throughout this area. There were some localities. Now, bear in mind, in that day, anybody ever been to Jamestown and seen the reconstructed fort? Those are the types of armaments that they had here. What you see, you know, the guides in the Jamestown fort. They had what they called firelocks. They were flintlocks, but before flint. There was a cord that was on a wheel, and you lit the cord and it came around and hit the touch pan and
pan.
set off the gunpowder and fired the gun. You couldn't hit a house with one of those things. It fired a 3/4 inch lead ball, like a 70 caliber lead ball. These armies got within 50, 60 yards of each other. They did have cannon, they had heavier armaments, but they just blazed away with these things, hoping they hit something. And if they did at that range, it was like getting hit in the chest with a brick thrown by Nolan Ryan from 10 feet away. It would take an arm off. It was brutal, it was ugly, and then after they would fire a couple of shots, the rest of it was completed with pikes and swords. And generally, they had as much cavalry as they could afford to have in the field, and they would find a weak spot throughout the battle, the ebb and flow of the battle. They would find a weak spot and send their cavalry to that weak spot. And that's what would end the fight for one side or the other. It was harsh, it was brutal, and the armies were relatively small by our standards. You had 20, 30,000, maybe 40,000 men in an army, and you could lose 10,000 of them in a shot. The other thing to remember is that these, whether Protestant or imperialist, I want to keep harping on Catholic, but whether they were imperialist or Protestant, they had to take everything with them. So if you have an army of 40,000 men, and 10,000 of them are cavalry, you have 10,000 horses to feed, you have 10,000 men to feed, you need water for all of them, ammunition, tents, medical supplies such as they were in that time, and it all had to be carried with you. And when they started running low on stuff, which they frequently did, where do you think they went to get it?
From the locals.
From the locals.
Yeah. They pillaged, wouldn't they?
And they were not content to pillage. Now I'm sure that Protestants were guilty. But the record does not show that they did it routinely. Because these were their homes. They lived here. The imperial and mercenary troops, Spanish troops, did not hesitate to kill women, children, to burn farms, to burn cities, thinking they would never have to come back. Well, long story short, when the war ended, there were parts of Germany that had lost 3/4 of their population. 3/4 of their population. The average throughout this whole area was a 40% reduction in population. Some localities took over 100 years to recover. What had once been very carefully tended German farms, tidy, productive, neat and clean, lay fertile for 100 years as a result of this. A price was paid for what they did. Now at the end, and here's the kicker, a lot of the German electors chose, rather than solidify the rights that had been bled so profusely for, to abscond or take over as much empty land as they could. To solidify for themselves an aggrandizement from their neighbors who had suffered. So after all of this, we had learned nothing. Nothing. But basically, when it came to an end, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 signaled the end of the last war of religion in Europe. There would never be another religious war in Europe. Think about this. 1648. And the martyrdoms had started in the 12th century. Had gone on for over 400 years. Now on a timeline, 400 years doesn't look like anything. But can you imagine living day by day, one day at a time, for over 400 years, never knowing whether you're going to see the next day or not? Can you imagine being a farmer in this area during this time? Even if the battles weren't fought on your farm, you never knew whether some outriders, some foraging party, were going to come and put an end to you. And this went on in this area for 30 years. 30 years. It was incredible. But it did end. So the question becomes, what now? What now? It's interesting that a lot of the electorates, well, they're not electorates anymore, of course, but in Germany returned to Catholicism, and that's fine. That if that's your choice, you should be able to freely choose that, and they did. Some of them. But we have been fortunate here where since the War of 1812, which basically was confined to a couple of different areas in the country, we haven't had to experience anything like this. Nothing. But that basically brings us, maybe I'll share some of this with you before we go. I couldn't remember all these numbers, so I just thought I'd bring my notes. The war killed soldiers and civilians directly, caused famines, destroyed livelihoods, disrupted commerce. Something else that wasn't happening during this time that you don't think about, but because of all the murder and mayhem and disruption, kids weren't being born. Women weren't having babies. So not only do the men of age die, and maybe their sons and daughters die, but others aren't being born to replace them. So you've got a gap of 60 years or more before a replacing population starts backfilling those who are gone. Some of these areas lay empty for 60 to 100 years. Now, it's hard for us to imagine that today. Because if you look at snapshots of Germany, or if you even go over there, you'll see, some monuments left to World War II to remind us and so forth. But Germany is lush for the most part. It is lush. And that's how it was before this. But it was the early 19th century before it recovered from this. For example, Württemberg lost 3/4 of its population during the war. In the region of Brandenburg, the losses had amounted to 50%, while in some areas an estimated 2/3 of the population died. The population, not soldiers, but the population. The population, overall, the male population of the German states was reduced by 1/3. half. 1/2. Other things that came about because of this, obviously, were famine and pestilence. You got soldiers from heaven knows where, on the imperialist side, moving into the area. You don't know what diseases they're bringing with them. You got disease, you got pestilence. Obviously, the people that were left, if all the farms were burnt out, what were they going to eat?
Starvation.
So there was that too. There was that too. On that happy note, I appreciate you all. Any comments, questions? Whether from now or weeks back?
Kind of amazing that they came back enough for the First World War, and then turned around after that and come back for the Second World War.
Well,
They just warlike people.
true enough. But I'll tell you what. The Germans had a different mindset. I don't want to say a different worldview, but they had a different mindset. I think largely stemming from this, they early on, when I say early, like the 1700s, 18th, 19th century, developed a sense of the fatherland. They developed a sense of the collective or the community rather than individualism. Right? They developed an idea that everything was for the well-being of the fatherland. And as a result, when they were still fractured until 1870, they were still a number of different states, although they had solidified some from the Treaty of Westphalia. But they were still states until 1870, when Bismarck made them a country. But, and this isn't, the Habsburgs were the descendants of Philip and Ferdinand. Yeah. They were the descendants of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor. They were the Habsburg dynasty. And when Prussia, and somehow they ended up way up in Prussia, when Prussia assumed the direct control of Germany overall, the Prussians were incredibly militaristic. That's how they kept order in their society, how they survived. They were incredibly militaristic. In fact, you recall, Prussians came to America during the American Revolution. That's what they did.
Mercenaries.
They hired out mercenaries like we mentioned earlier, the Swiss did. That was a common way to raise revenue in Germany, because they had a lot, by this time they had a lot more people and nothing for them to do.
Well, then you had Napoleon and the French
Huh.
and expansionism.
Sure.
Yeah, it was like what, Louisiana and all that period of time.
Yeah. I mean, it's not too far after this. Oh, I forgot my thought. When all that happened, this same type of thing during World War I came about, with the age-old antagonism between France and Germany. World War I was a bloodbath for 5 years,
And led to World War II.
beyond what we can today imagine. How any of those men, those that survived, they were on those battlefields and didn't lose their minds, I don't know. Trenches were dug with dead bodies in the walls of the trenches.
Yeah,
Rats were,
eating them.
I mean, it's mind-boggling. I don't know how they didn't lose their minds. And the shelling, the concussion from those shells could kill you without leaving a mark on your body. It was amazing. But what Brian alluded to, when that was finally over, yes, World War I brought about World War II, but the French didn't have any stomach anymore. They had no stomach for it. I mean, they had lost, just like these casualties we were just talking about, an entire generation and a half of French males had disappeared during World War I. It disappeared. So that when World War II started, nary a shot was fired. They said, no, we are not doing this again. And it left England, who had suffered nearly as badly, proportionately, because of course their population was much smaller, left England to fend them off by themselves until the French could recover and we entered the war. But all the way back to George Washington, he counseled us to stay out of European politics. Don't get involved, those people are nuts.
Wise man.
Yeah, don't get involved, those people are nuts. So we will wrap it up week after next. We talked about, I think that we are going to, after we get squarely done here, we will reconvene or quite frankly, I think we're just going to start over our Romans Bible study. And I'm going to talk to the folks at Thousand Hills and see if we can't have it there.
Where is that?
Right there in Daleville.
Food line.
Right
Oh,
around.
okay.
Cross-
Food line.
Yeah.
Yeah, in
It's the
that,
coffee house.
yeah, in that complex, the tap house and
Yeah.
something else is
Yeah,
there.
it's got
Yeah.
that.
But you go around the backside and it's right in there.
Great goodies.
Oh,
Yeah.
Just what I need.
Yeah, we do.
Well, I was thinking it would, make it a little more comfortable, and if you want a cup of coffee or need to use the restroom, and plus the fact,
They serve
All-
food too.
it's good to do sometimes, but when you meet consistently in someone's home, the natural thing is you put them in the position of feeling like they gotta clean the house and plus the fact, by going into Thousand Hills into a public place, somebody may hear what we're talking about and be interested.
And the people that run it are Christian.
Yeah. In fact, the coffee they sell is from, it's kind of a mission, a ministry.
They're really
So
nice people.
that's the plan, but we'll wait until this gets good and finished, and then we'll just start all over. And I'm hoping that that'll be a good venue to meet in. We gotta get public. Gotta get public. And by the way, sometimes this summer, I have been thinking about getting a sandwich board sign that says the end is near and marching out in front of Kroger. Would anyone like to join me on that? little
The
adventure?
missionary meaning
Sure,
at the
I'll
end of the
do it.
world.
I'll just,
I'm
Being
I-
facetious.
I always thought, I don't know if you all remember this or not, but some years ago when the Domino's or Little Caesars or something opened, and they paid that kid to be out front, and that one boy or another, bless their hearts, for 8 hours at a whack would stand in the sun and spin that pizza and all that. I'm going, he'll do that for probably $7 an hour. Why aren't we willing to stand out there and say Jesus lives or hold up signs? I mean, it's don't make good sense, as my mother used to say. Anyway, Phil, you want to send us on our merry way, please?
You're a big one. What'd you say? Me?
Philip.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Kathy, just whacking for me. And
Okay, Lord, we just, we come to you and we thank you, Lord. It's been a good day. It's been a beautiful day that you've given us, and just being in your house and this morning in our Sunday school class and the message that you've given us there, and then followed by Rob's sermon, and then the communion, Lord, and remembrance of what all you did for us. We just can't thank you enough. Thanks for Dave and this timeline of history that he's presented to us. Please keep us safe all as we go home. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Especially those who travel Country Club Road.